Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final installment of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's Global Tipping Point Speaker Series, Reestablishing United States Global Climate Diplomacy. This is our last program of the year, and we have been so excited with the turnout for all of our events, with over 3,000 people tuning in from all around the Granite State and all around the country, watching our 39 events this year, and more than 150 tuned in tonight so far. We're so happy you've decided to join us this evening. And for those of you who are watching the replay, we're excited that you're engaging with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's programming. We do hope that all of you are staying safe and well, both physically and mentally, in these trying times for our state, our country, and our community. And we are so glad you are a part of our community here at WACNH. You know, with the coronavirus still a worry for many, community support is the only way we come out of this crisis stronger. My name is Maura Sullivan, and I am a proud board member for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. WACNH is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to helping people better understand the challenges that we are facing in the world today. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, it's more important than ever that people understand these complex global issues. And that is what we at the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire are focused on, and why we have committed to bringing these timely online programs to our global community. As a membership organization, the Council is supported by a generous community of global citizens, and these programs are made possible by members and donors, ensuring that the Council's good work can continue. We thank and we appreciate everyone who assists the Council and hope that if you are not yet a member, that you will consider joining or donating to keep these programs alive. You can find out more information on our membership at our website, or make a tax-deductible contribution to the organization by texting WACNH to 44321. That's 44321. We are still about $2,000 from our matching fund goal for our year-end fundraiser, which is coming up. So every dollar that is donated will be matched dollar for dollar up to our goal of $5,000. Your help and generosity and support is so very much appreciated. We would also like to thank Rob Werner and the League of Conservation Voters for co-hosting this wonderful series with us. It has been such a treat to work with Rob and his team, as well as the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for their generous support as well. We simply would not be able to do this without both of these admirable organizations. In addition, we would like to thank our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, for all of the support that they have provided over the past 20 years. Our council is stronger for your assistance. Also, as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, the Council does not promote a political position, party, issue, or candidate. We are here to provide a platform for discussion and hope you will draw your own conclusions from the information presented. Therefore, the content of tonight's program contains the views of the speakers and do not necessarily represent those of the Council, its board of directors, staff, sponsors, or members. For those for whom is their first time watching one of our events, welcome. We are so glad you've joined us. We will be taking questions throughout the night, which is definitely one of the most fun parts of our events. So please do send us your queries so that we can have a full and robust conversation after our three incredible speakers finish their opening remarks. You can send your questions to our email address at wacnh.org or to one of our social media accounts, or just use the Messenger app at the bottom right on our website. I'm going to turn the program over in a second to my friend and New Hampshire State Director for the League of Conservation Voters, Rob Werner. We are just, before I do that we are just in for such a treat tonight with Todd Stern, Brigadier General Stephen Cheney, and our own senior senator, Jeanne Shaheen, who has done so much work on these critical issues, serves our country honorably on our Foreign Relations Committee. And it's just such a treat to be able to have her here to share some of her insight with us. So with that, Rob, appreciate everything you've done to put this together, and look forward to turning it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Maura. And thanks also to Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and Events and Education Coordinator of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, Mike Pappas, for helping to make these programs and this series such a success. Our final installment of the Global Tipping Points Climate and National Security series will focus on looking ahead to 2021 and the opportunities for the U.S. to re-engage with the international community on climate change action and negotiations. The Biden-Harris administration places a very high priority on reestablishing global climate diplomacy. In the previous two programs, we focused on the impact of climate change on our national security, both internationally and here at home. Global climate change acts as an accelerant of instability or threat multiplier, making existing problems worse as vulnerable populations around the world are impacted. Rising seas and extreme weather events impact military infrastructure in places such as Naval Base Norfolk and here in New Hampshire at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. These previous programs are all available at any time at the World Affairs Council New Hampshire website. As Maura said, we have three accomplished speakers with us this evening. I'm going to be introducing them. First, Brigadier General Stephen Cheney, U.S. Marine Corps retired, is president of the American Security Project. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and has over 30 years experience as a Marine. His career included a wide variety of command and staff positions with the operating forces and the supporting establishment. General Cheney's primary specialty was artillery, but he focused extensively on entry-level training, commanding at every echelon at both Marine Corps recruit depots, to include being the commanding general at Parris Island. He served several years in Japan and has traveled extensively throughout the Middle East and Asia. Other selected highlights of General Cheney's military career include tours as Deputy Executive Secretary to Defense Secretaries Cheney and Aspen, Ground Plans Officer for Drug Enforcement Policy in the Pentagon, liaison to the Congressional Commission on Roles and Missions of the Armed Forces, and Inspector General of the Marine Corps. Following retirement from the Marines, General Cheney became the Chief Operating Officer for Business Executives for National Security in Washington, D.C., and most recently was President and CEO of the Marine Military Academy in Harlingen, Texas. General Cheney is a graduate of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, the National War College, and the University of Southern California. He was a military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he's a member. Additionally, he was also a member of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board and the Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. General Cheney has been on the board of directors for American Security Project since 2006 and served as ASP's CEO from 2011 to 2019. Todd Stern is non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, concentrating on climate change. Stern served from January 2009 until April 2016 as the special envoy for climate change at the Department of State. He was President Obama's chief climate negotiator, leading the U.S. effort in negotiating the Paris Agreement and on all bilateral and multilateral climate negotiations in the 7 years leading up to Paris. Stern also participated in the development of a U.S. domestic climate and clean energy policy. Stern is currently focused on writing about the climate negotiations during his time as special envoy, as well as on writing, speaking, and advising about ongoing efforts on climate change at both the international and domestic levels. Stern served under President Clinton in the White House from 1993 to 1999, mostly as assistant to the president and staff secretary. From 1997 to 1999, he coordinated the administration's initiative on global climate change, acting as the senior White House negotiator at the Kyoto and Buenos Aires negotiations. From 1999 to 2001, Stern served as counselor to Secretary of the Treasury Lawrence Summers, advising the Secretary on the policy and politics of a broad range of economic and financial issues, and supervising Treasury's anti-money laundering strategy. Senator Jeanne Shaheen is the first woman in U.S. history to be elected both a governor and a United States senator. And she has served in the Senate since 2009 as a member of the Senate Committees on Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Appropriations, Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and the Select Committee on Ethics. Shaheen recognizes the severity of the environmental and economic threat that climate change poses to New Hampshire and the world. She supports smart energy policies that will curb carbon pollution and preserve New Hampshire's way of life. As a champion of energy efficiency, Shaheen created programs while governor that saved New Hampshire families and businesses over $1 billion. In the Senate, Shaheen has worked across the aisle in Congress to pass national energy efficiency legislation, which was signed into law by President Obama. Further, Shaheen established a goal of more than 50% clean and carbon-free electricity by 2030. Between her time as governor and election to the U.S. Senate, Shaheen served as director of Harvard University's Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School of Government. So right now, what I'm going to do is turn it over to General Cheney for some opening remarks, and then we will have a moderated discussion. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience. Take it away, General Cheney.
Rob, thank you very much. And certainly thanks to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and the League of Conservation Voters. Special thanks to Todd Stern and all the work that you've done in our executive department on climate change and national security. And of course, to Senator Shaheen, toiling arduously on the Hill. I really don't envy what's going on up there these days. So thank you for doing that. A special shout out to Alex Hatbarth, who's our ASP climate director, who helps put these items together for us. Rob, quick correction. You mentioned I was a member of the Foreign Affairs Policy Board and the International Security Advisory Board. Well, I was until February of 2016, when I got a quick phone call to send my pass in that my clearances were invalidated. And as far as I can tell, those boards have never been constituted under the current administration and no longer exist, although statutorily they are there. Let me talk for a couple of minutes just about the background of ASP and how I got into this business and how ASP is into this business. Rob, if I talk a little bit too long, as King Henry VIII told his several wives, I won't keep you that long, just pull out the hook. And the beauty of now doing this virtually is you can just turn me off. But we have a very strong New Hampshire connection here at ASP. We were founded in 2005 by 4 senators, Kerry, Hart, Hagel, and Rudman. And I'm sure I would hope, remember Warren Rudman well. I met with him many, many times talking about ASP and what our program was. And the reason we started that way was then Senator Kerry, coming off the 2004 election, needless to say, was not exactly ecstatic about the result, but he was really disturbed that when he talked climate change, it immediately got painted as a partisan issue. And he got painted as, I think, the left-wing liberal that he is, and nobody would listen to him. So he thought, can I put together a group that can take the partisanship out of this and just talk the national security perspective? And he shifted over to talking about to retired military flag officers, although I think a lot more of them have gotten more political lately, a little bit to my chagrin. But nonetheless, he said, I can put together a group of 3- and 4-star admirals and generals, put them on this board. None of them will have any party dedication, and he will talk the national security implications of climate change. And he did that. And then he said, I can start the board with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, which of course the Republicans were Hagel and Rudman, and the Democrats were Hart and Kerry, who all remain on the board today, of course, except for dear Warren. Then he added on the 3- and 4 stars, and we've got several of the original 3- and 4 stars still on the board today. Fox Fallon, the former CENTCOM commander, Dan Chrisman, former superintendent of West Point, are just but 2. And our current chairperson, by the way, is Governor Christine Todd Whitman, former Republican governor of New Jersey, former EPA administrator under Bush 43. So that gives you a little bit of a background on that. ASP is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization, and we focus on long-term national security threats. We examine a lot of other topics, to include nuclear nonproliferation. We got well involved in the New START Treaty back in 2010, 2011. Counterterrorism, energy security is high on our list. And of course, today's topic, climate security. We also have an ancillary group, recognizing that just this group is not enough to talk this issue, not only in the United States, but around the world. So we have a cadre of retired general and flag officers, as well as many former senior government officials, known as the Consensus for American Security, and they all work together to develop a consensus around the strategic national security issues facing our country. You can pull all of this up on our website, including all the members. Consensus members support our key policies issues designed to move defense and foreign policies toward a more smart and comprehensive 21st century national security strategy. We host forums all over the world and public events to primarily educate decision makers about the dangers of failing to address today's threats. And of course, we think one of the most prominent is climate change. Climate security has been one of the major pillars for us since our founding. We are, of course, not just thrilled, we're delighted that President-elect Biden has appointed Secretary Kerry, a founding and current member of ASP, as the special presidential envoy for climate change. And his appointment is a really very important step in elevating climate change as a national security issue and restoring America's climate credibility internationally. One unique feature of ASP's climate security work is our National Climate Security Tour. And we've gone all over the country and the world talking about this issue and educating folks. I've been to dozens of universities and cities. I think I got New Hampshire boxed in. I've been to MIT, and then I went up to Colby College last year in Maine, but I've not been to the University of New Hampshire, so I'd gladly take that invite up. Almost a year ago exactly to this day, I was sitting in Berlin as a guest of Chatham House out of London, but I went Berlin, Brussels, and London talking about this issue. And you can imagine now what the tension was then, because it was following the election of President Trump, and they were exceptionally worried about what's going to happen to this issue and where the United States would go. And I'm sad to say, I think all their doubts came true. Interesting, I would have gone back, but with COVID, of course, I didn't. I think their attitude now is one of somewhat relief, and I can talk about that here in a little bit. So let me talk about the national security threats that are posed by climate change. And according to the DoD Inspector General's recently released annual list of challenges, released in November, a month back, confronting the Department of Military are rising sea levels, extreme weather such as flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, melting Arctic, that all require the Department of Defense to consider the safety, security, readiness, and financial implications of these non-traditional threats. And I went online again today to read that report, and it's interesting. It lists all those things specifically. I still cannot find the two words climate change in that report. I won't say the deniers, but the administration's done a masterful job of cleansing all the documents of the two words climate change. At ASP, we have long discussed the ways climate change, extreme heat, drought, wildfires, storms, rising sea levels, all threaten U.S. national security and our interests. So let me talk for a minute about the heat side of it. As the former commanding general at Paris Island, I'm extremely concerned about heat in the summer. As you can imagine, it's very hot, very humid. And you've got about 22 or 23,000 new recruits coming through there every year. Our concern was their health and welfare. In 2008, there were 1,766 cases of heat stroke or heat exhaustion among active duty service members across the DoD. 1766, 2008. In 2018, there were 2,800. That's a 60% increase in a decade. Now, I can't attribute that all to climate change, but I will tell you that's a significant factor in there. In the Marine Corps, the rate of heat stroke more than doubled over that specific period. The lethal danger of extreme heat poses a risk to our service members and has significant financial costs. Health impacts alone from heat cost the military over $1 billion from 2008 to 2018. So let me talk for a second about drought and wildfires. In late 2016, there was a fire near Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. It covered over 10,000 acres, forced closure of the southern portion of the base, and it delayed several satellite launches. Flip over to Nebraska. Let's talk about flooding for a minute. And going back to California for a second, by the way, now Marines are starting to train and have helped fight the wildfires in California, which of course everybody knows have been the worst ever. Flooding is continuing to be a problem just about everywhere. Nebraska's Offutt Air Force Base in 2019 had $420 million in damage and flooding. The storms and the hurricanes are legendary, especially this year, as you can imagine. I went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which is one of the Marine Corps largest training bases. I went there in May of 2019 and saw firsthand the damage that was caused by Hurricane Florence. Now, Florence, when it hit Camp Lejeune, was a high Category 1, low Category 2 hurricane. So you can imagine what a 3, 4, or 5 would have done. They had $3.4 billion worth of damage caused at Camp Lejeune and the air stations nearby at New River and Cherry Point. At that time, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, a general named Bob Neller, who I know well, he was forced to curtail and cancel several training exercises to free up funds for hurricane repair, and they had to delay deploying units from relieving units overseas because they had to do a hurricane assistance there on base. Let me switch to Tyndall Air Force Base in October 2018, and Hurricane Michael, you may recall, it virtually wiped that base off the map. The beauty to the Air Force is they're in the business of airplanes. So they moved all the airplanes out except those that they couldn't fix, which stayed there mostly. They were F-35s, I might add. So they had significant damage to those. Now they're talking about rebuilding it, which is a little bit beyond my comprehension, but I understand the politics, at least at a cost of $3 billion. And in part due to the damage at Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases, the Air Force had to consider grounding all combat aircraft. They deferred 61 facility repairs and cut the flying hours for all non-deploying squadrons. Now, all of this affects the readiness of the national readiness of the U.S. military, and is certainly a national security risk. I'm going to shift one more time here and talking, I call this the tactical side, shift to flooding, and we'll talk about Norfolk here for a second. And you think Navy's in ships, they don't have to worry about flooding. Well, they have a huge problem down in Norfolk and Hampton Roads, and they understand it. They've been working this issue for ages. One of the problems is that as the water rises, it goes over the docks, and the electricity that comes through the docks to the ships that are docked there has to be cut. So they're in the process of raising all the piers there. They have allocated several billion to that particular project, and they've done about half of them. But you can imagine the problem that is. And then they have a flooding problem. The base has flooded dozens of times over the past couple of years. When the sailors can't get to the ships, then the ships can't deploy. Again, a huge national security problem. Let me talk a little bit about climate security abroad. We certainly know it's going to contribute to instability. I often talk about Diego Garcia, which is a base we have in the Indian Ocean. We've got a brigade's worth of Marine Corps equipment there. It's actually a British territory. We know that island's going to go underwater. I mean, it's a fact. We're going to have to move that brigade's worth of equipment somewhere. You talk about another readiness issue, especially with the threat now posed in South China Sea from China. It's a problem they're facing everywhere there. In the Pacific Command alone, Admiral Locklear, when he was the Pacific Command combatant commander for Pacific Command, said his number one threat was climate change. And some would say, well, why didn't you say China or North Korea or terrorism? And he said, because he knows climate change is occurring. He knows it's going to cause instability. He knows it's going to cause problems that he's going to have to counter as the Pacific Command commander. So you can see that is just going to be a terrible problem that he's going to have there. We have destabilization occurring all over the world. Now, predicting where and when these events are going to occur may not necessarily be possible. However, it is possible to identify specific areas where climate change is impacting stability in the areas and that we're going to have to respond. I'm going to give you two major examples, and then I've got several other ones that perhaps we can cover in the Q&A. But first, I'm going to go back to South Asia. As you know, we're very concerned about China and what China is doing, and it's building the islands. I often say if there's any plus to climate change, all these islands that China is putting forces on are going to go underwater because the water is just going to keep rising. So maybe there's a little bit of a plus there. But nonetheless, we know there's going to be huge problems. It's certainly fresh water supply. There are 6 major Asian rivers: Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salin, and Mekong, and a lot of them are controlled by China. The Himalayan glacier melt is changing monsoon rainfall patterns and threaten the livelihoods, and there's going to be food and water scarcity to more than 1 billion people in South Asia. Let's look at Bangladesh for a minute. A 1 meter rise in sea level is going to cause, and this is not an exaggeration, 30 million climate refugees. And the sad part about this is they feel they know it's coming. They understand it. I've been with them. The Bangladeshis, I have several senior military friends. Their problem is, where do you relocate 30 million refugees? And they really don't have the capacity to do that. So then where do they go? They're going to go to other places in Southeast Asia. And they could well end up in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, by the way, and in which there's a very strong ISIS footprint in Indonesia, which takes advantage of all this instability. So you can see South Asia is got a big problem, and I think Locklear was right to say that when he talked about being its number one threat. Let me move over to an area that's often not talked about in terms of climate change and instability, and that's Latin America. You know, as we well know, look at Venezuela and several of the other governments there. They're fragile. There's been unrest. We've got problems with Cuba. And Central America has huge economic problems. And a lot of, I'd say almost the majority of the folks that are leaving Central America trying to come across our borders are economic refugees. They can't support themselves anymore. And certainly they're fleeing that instability. But climate change is contributing to that instability in Latin and Central America because the crops are going under. They either got too much rain or too little. They can't cope with it. The governments are unstable. We know that Southern Command's got its hands full talking about that. We need a systemic, dynamic, and deliberate approach to incorporate climate-induced changes to all our strategic assessments, particularly in Southern Command. Now, I didn't even get into the Middle East and talk about Syria, which had its worst drought in history from 2006 to 2011, drove millions into towns like Aleppo, which I think some of us are familiar with now. Who took advantage of that? ISIS did. Assad in Syria bombed the people in Aleppo. They were all gathered there because they couldn't grow their crops outside. I mean, that's a huge problem. I didn't talk about Africa, the Sahel, the drying up of Lake Chad, which is somewhat stabilized a little bit, but Boko Haram has taken great advantage of that. So there's going to be huge problems in Africa. So I think I've outlined some of the threats that climate change poses to our national security at home and abroad. Unfortunately, even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, there are enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to perpetuate climate-induced threats for decades to come. We have to get on top of this right now. And that's why then Senator Kerry or Secretary Kerry created an ancillary group called World War Zero, because he really does feel that this is a world war, and we've got to stop it. It makes it more imperative that we in the global community achieve net zero carbon emissions as soon as we can, and we've got to get back into the game. We've lost 4 years. I mean, when you expunge the words climate change from virtually any document in our government, then people think it's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal. And of course, we dropped out of the Paris Accord. And Todd, I know you're going to talk about this. I mean, how we can be a world leader and not get into these back into these treaties is beyond me. And China took advantage of all this. We drop out of the TPP. China steps in. They're showing leadership that we just have not had, and it's going to be problematic, I will tell you. I know President-elect Biden has very ambitious climate goals. We've got to rebuild our climate credibility. Appointing Kerry as a special presidential envoy for climate change is going to help do that. It's going to treat it as the national security threat that it is, and elevating his position to a member of the National Security Council is just wonderful. So we've got a long, long ways to go and not a lot of time to do it. So I hope I've laid out in a kind of a broad brush way here on the tactical side, bases of stations, on the strategic side, international instability. We play a hand in all this, and we've really got to do a lot more on climate change. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Rob.
Thanks so much to Brigadier General Cheney and Semper Fidelis. I spent 2 years in the Marines stationed at Camp Lejeune. Appreciate you sharing that story and just kind of bringing home to all of us just the threat that a lot of our coastal bases, including our Portsmouth Naval Shipyard right here.
And one last word here, and by the way, Pete Army, the Naval Academy is going to West Point for the Army Navy game this Saturday. The Naval Academy was one of the bases listed in the IG's report in November as seriously threatened to be going underwater, if you can imagine. So just another side. Thank you. And thanks for your service, Maura.
Thank you. Thank you for yours and your leadership. I don't even want to waste any time jumping right into just having Todd give a few remarks, and then Senator Shaheen, and touching on, if you would, as General Cheney mentioned, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, the importance of U.S. climate engagement, and of course the status of our global climate ambition, and just give us maybe a sense of, what can we expect, with this terrific news. That Secretary Kerry is going to be leading as the special presidential envoy for climate change. I know Senator Shaheen, you've done a lot of work with the secretary. So maybe just sort of give us a sense of that, and what do our first 100 days look like?
Well, thank you very much, Maura. Thanks to you and the World Affairs Council in New Hampshire, as well as to Rob and the LCV. And honored to be on this panel with General Cheney and of course Senator Shaheen. So very, very pleased about that. And let me just say, I could not agree more emphatically with that really superb presentation that you all just heard from General Cheney. Climate change has been a first order national security threat for some time now. It took a while for many people to get it. Actually the Pentagon and the intelligence community have been on it for years. But I think that it is this message is getting through now. Just a few comments about President-elect Biden and where I think that he's going to try to take us on the international side with the Paris Agreement and other things. Biden ran on climate change. This was a genuine commitment. This wasn't just an issue that showed up on his website. He ran on this, and what presidents run on, they tend to want to do. It was one of his 4 core priorities that he talked about in his convention speech. He has committed to net zero by 2050. He's committed to 100% clean power by 2035, green recovery, and so forth. So he has been very made clear his commitment. He talks about climate change on all of the calls he's had with foreign leaders. We have every reason to believe that he's going to carry through with that. So on the international side, a few points. First of all, the number one focus on the international side has to be, to begin with, full throttle on the domestic side, because you don't get credibility internationally unless you walk the walk at home, not just talk the talk. I saw that in spades when I was working for President Obama. And so that's going to be hugely important, and he is committed to doing that. Second, as General Cheney said, the selection of John Kerry is just terrific. I worked for him for 3 years at the State Department. It was an enormously strong signal internationally, and I have been in all sorts of track 2 dialogues and other kinds of communications with the Chinese, the Indians, the EU, the UK, and so forth all fall. And that appointment is extremely well received. Third, of course, he's going to announce plans to join Paris on day 1, and you can do that. It's only going to take 30 days to go through the technicalities. So we'll be back in Paris quickly. We will have to put together a new target, a so-called NDC, nationally determined commitment in the lingo, which will be due by the COP, the big international conference that's held at the end of this year, this time in Glasgow, and with the UK as the host. And I have no doubt that that's going to be an ambitious and strong target to get us back in the game. The fourth thing I would say is that thinking about climate change internationally, you need to understand that the core diplomatic mission, of course, is now quite different from what it was when I was there. The core diplomatic mission for us was to put together an international agreement that all countries could be part of, that was durable and strong, ambitious, and that created the new regime that you have to have in order to deal with climate change internationally. And that ultimately became the Paris Agreement. Now the mission, we have Paris now. So the diplomatic mission now is to drive the transformation of the global economy at speed and at scale. And it needs to go much faster and much more in a much more aggressive fashion, even than we knew in Paris, because the understanding of climate involved people all over the world is that the 2-degree goal, the less than 2-degree goal that was the core goal of Paris, isn't good enough yet. Now, the IPCC report, the UN Science Bodies report from 2018, made it clear that we really have to be aiming at 1.5, which is the best efforts goal in Paris, and that only makes the job even harder. The fifth is with respect to diplomacy. I think a few things to keep in mind. One, the U.S. has to come back. I will say that countries around the world are eager to have the United States back. They're delighted to have the United States with a new president-elect who's going to bring us back into the action. They're also wary about the United States because they've seen what can happen in elections. So there's going to, and you're not going to be able to get away from that. There's going to be a mix of eagerness and wariness, but they're looking for us to come back with leadership, with some due humility, because we're the ones who've been gone for the last 4 years, but definitely exercising leadership. President-elect Biden has talked about holding a climate summit, which he will do as he talked about in his campaign, which I think is going to be a good opportunity to start to demonstrate that. We will need to work very closely with the EU, probably our most important ally. The EU is really leading the world right now with respect to where they're going on climate, with all of those goals, but also with regulatory plans to get them there. China is going to be a huge challenge. China is really important. We built a very important climate relationship with China during the Obama years. The relationship now is more troubled than it has been for a very long time. It is deteriorating compared to where it was before. And that's the perception on both sides of the aisle among Democrats and Republicans. And yet you cannot solve the climate problem without China. They're 28% of global emissions. So it's going to be a big challenge. And I think they're quite eager to work with us on climate, but that'll be a big priority. India, Brazil, other key emerging countries. Brazil, a particular problem because of their president, Bolsonaro, who is doing very bad things to the Amazon, which is enormously important. Also important to pull together the progressive developing countries who, at the time of Paris, pulled together into something then called the High Ambition Coalition. They're important not so much because they add up to such a large quantity of emissions, but because they have moral authority and they can put pressure on the right players, very much including players like China and others. And so we need to be working with them. And we need to be focusing on a number of important tools. There's a real need for significant financial reform throughout the international financial institutions. We have to have financial investment now aligned with climate goals. It doesn't work anymore to be financing fossil fuel kinds of investments. So we need a lot more money to be going to developing countries, and we need it to be the right kind. Trade is going to be a big issue. The EU is highly focused on developing carbon border adjustments with respect to countries who are not doing enough on climate change and whose exports don't include any of the costs that should go in there, and that will be I think also something important to look at. Carbon risk disclosure all over the world in the major financial centers is going to be important. We now have a very good set of principles that was initiated in the first instance by Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England, through a process that went on for several years. There's a good set of guidelines. It needs to become mandatory now in the core financial capitals. And we need to finally start to do something about fossil fuel subsidies, which are close to $1 trillion a year. Imagine that, $1 trillion a year going to help produce more fossil fuels. That's just crazy. So I know I don't want to talk too long here, so let me stop now and pass it to Senator Shaheen and then to the questions.
Okay, so I will jump right in. Thank you very much, Todd, and thank you to General Cheney. I really appreciated your laying out the threat to our national security and to the world's security. And of course, I had the opportunity to hear from Todd back when he was heading up our negotiations in Paris for the Paris Climate Accords. And it was 5 years ago this week that the Paris Accords were adopted. And I got to participate with 9 other senators to go over and show the flag for the United States to make sure that people understood that despite what they had heard about climate deniers here, there are a lot of us who were trying to do something to support the administration. So what I want to talk about is what's happening in Congress, because as Todd said, this is a global threat, and we've got to, what we do at home is going to be important as we think about what happens around the world. I had the opportunity today to speak by Zoom with Tony Blinken, who is President-elect Biden's nominee to be Secretary of State. And one of the things he talked about was the importance, as Todd said, of the United States taking back our leadership position in the world on issues like climate change and how important that will be to what's happening globally. But we've got to take action here at home as well. And the Senate hasn't passed a comprehensive energy bill since 2007. We have a bill that has gotten out of the Senate Energy Committee. There's a bill that's gotten out of the House Energy Committee. I think it's very unlikely that that legislation is actually going to pass both houses and be signed in this session of Congress. So we have to look at what we need to do here at home in Congress to set policies that are going to promote a response to address climate change. One of my first major pieces of legislation as a senator was with Rob Portman to address energy efficiency. Of course, 40% of our energy use is in buildings, and we introduced legislation. This is the 5th Congress. We have reintroduced it, and we've got pieces of it done. But the major piece that is in there that provides for energy savings is energy efficiency through building codes that we would incentivize states to adopt. They're not mandatory, they're voluntary. And yet we can't get over the hump of our Republican colleagues being willing to support voluntary building codes. If we could do this, what it would do would be to save about $50 billion for consumers in energy costs by 2050. It would save 1.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions, which is the equivalent of taking 280 million cars off the road a year. And it would create over 100,000 jobs, according to the American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy. So there are actions that we can take, but we need to get the will to address those. And I think the best news, as both General Cheney and Todd have said, is the fact that we have a new president-elect in Joe Biden who is going to elevate this issue in the campaign. He talked about 4 threats to the United States, and climate change was one of those threats. So he's clearly committed. His appointment of John Kerry shows that, and it sends a signal to the United States and to the world that we are ready to take action. Now, we have had a little progress in the Senate because this year we started the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, and we have been meeting 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. It's bipartisan, the first time since I've been in the Senate, and I've been here since 2009, that we've had a bipartisan group that's talking about how we address climate change. So it's an important step forward. We just had a meeting by Zoom with Franz Timmermans from the European Union. He's their executive vice president for the European Green Deal. And we talked about how we can cooperate with the EU on some of these initiatives and be prepared for Glasgow next year with some ideas for how we're going to work together to address climate change. So programs like this are really important. Thank you to LCV and to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire for supporting this, and to all of you who are listening in. I look forward to the conversation and the questions. Thanks.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, both Todd and Senator Shaheen, for your extensive comments and insights. We'll go ahead and dive right in. We're going to do just a few minutes of questions with the three of you, and then we will open it up to the audience for a little bit of Q&A. I'd like to just start out with Senator Shaheen. You had mentioned, first of all, that this is very promising about this bipartisan Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. It's terrific and really encouraging news. You play and very proudly represent our state on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and in a historic role as right now the only woman on that committee. At a time when, as General Cheney mentioned, we have a lot of work to do, and Todd touched on this too, in terms of repairing relationships with our allies and kind of coming back to the table right after 4 years that we lost. Can you just shed a little bit of light on, on the committee's priorities and your priorities, is how you think about kind of going about what is going to be some pretty extensive work?
Well, I think one of the first things, as Todd has suggested, that the new administration is going to do is rejoin many of the multilateral institutions that we have left in the last 4 years. And obviously the Paris Agreement is one of those, but the World Health Organization, we're going to start supporting UNFPA and women and families around the world again, in so many areas. And that will be very important in sending a signal. And it will be important for the Foreign Relations Committee to support those initiatives. Now, remember, depending on what happens in Georgia, we're still going to have a divided government. We're going to have a House that's going to be controlled by Democrats, a Senate controlled by Republicans, where the Republican majority leader, Mitch McConnell, does not really acknowledge that climate change is a threat that we need to address. So one of the things we will need to do is to encourage that bipartisan effort, the kinds of things that the Climate Solutions Caucus are working on. And again, I'm encouraged that we have a bipartisan effort that we're talking about what we can do. And the fact that Glasgow meeting gives us an opportunity to think about how we can work with our colleagues in the EU to come up with some initiatives that we can both agree to try and accomplish, both in the EU and here in Congress, I think is a really important opportunity for us as we think about the future.
Thank you. Todd, I think we were all really encouraged when you spoke about the need to go full throttle on this on the domestic side as well, and then talking about the president-elect's idea of a climate summit. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that, and what would be success coming out of that summit? What are the three things that you'd love to see coming out of there?
So look, I don't know what their specific plans are. I'll tell you what the kinds of things that I'd love to see. I think that he will the president-elect will pull together a kind of good-sized group, which is not to say 100 and something countries, but a manageable-sized group with all of the major players there. If it were me, I would take a certain amount of time to in a word, to educate. I mean, the thing you can't forget is that the mindset that leaders have is just enormously important. I mean, look at the just astonishing things that countries have done in response to COVID, because they suddenly realized, oh my God, we've got to do this. So you'll take an entire country and shut it down in 3 days, right? I mean, things that nobody could have ever expected. We can do everything that we need to do to move at scale and speed with respect to to the technology, with respect to the financing, and so forth, and with respect to the policy levers that need to happen. What we need is political will. So I would take a little bit of time at the beginning of that summit, and have the world-class best scientists, who are also good speakers, to walk through what is at stake and what needs to happen as quickly as it needs to happen. So I would do that. I would think that it would be a useful place to talk about the kinds of important international initiatives that could be undertaken to drive down emissions. You could talk about things like retiring coal plants, and how you can do that, and how you can do it affordably around the world. There are good reports and such out there on those subjects. You could talk about kinds of things that the CEOs of big companies working with the leaders of countries in important but difficult to abate sectors like cement, like steel and chemicals, some of the heavy sectors that are very polluting. Perhaps there are international standards, global standards that could be put together that would be much better. I think, as I think I alluded to earlier, there's a big job that needs to be done with respect to finance, and that's going to include reforms that are needed in the IMF, in the multilateral development banks, debt relief that's going to need to go to countries in Africa and elsewhere, so that green investments can flow. I mean, a lot of countries you can't get any green investment there because of their debt problems. And then I think a focus on innovation in the big sectors where we don't have what we need yet. I think all of those things could be usefully discussed. So I mean, they may have 17 other ideas, but there's plenty that you could do. I would just say one other kind of related thing. The most important diplomatic vehicle that we had when I was there was the Major Economies Forum, which President Obama started. It was a forum that allowed us to meet several times a year, usually at the ministerial level, one time initially at the leader level. I would bring something like that back. Maybe the summit would be a kind of first kickoff of that, potentially, at the leader level, every year or two at least, with sort of at the senior so-called Sherpa level below that, but where the focus now isn't how do we negotiate a new agreement, but how do we drive the transformation that we need at scale and at speed. So I think the summit is certainly could be the kickoff of something that in one way or another could last beyond it.
Great, thank you. The next question is for General Cheney, although Senator Shaheen, perhaps you might like to comment as well from your leadership on the Senate Armed Services Committee. General Cheney, from your time in the Marine Corps, could you maybe share with us, some of the things you might be looking for from the Pentagon? There's the president-elect has indicated his nominee, within the last 24 hours. I think one of the more promising things we saw coming out of the Obama-Biden administration was the Navy leading the way on introducing biofuels to fleet of Navy ships around the world via the Great Green Fleet, and getting a certain percentage of ships to be operating, on biofuels. But just wondering if you could touch on, what you might like to see. And then Senator Shaheen, obviously, would love to hear, your thoughts as well.
Well, again, I'm going to take a twofold approach to this. I'm going to talk the tactical side and what DoD can do internally, and then what ought to be done externally. The big hammer that Congress has over DoD is the National Defense Authorization Act, which, Senator, I guess is going to pass tomorrow, the next day, maybe.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. Now, understandably, that's under the current administration, although I think there's been some things taken out of it that would be detrimental, and it's going to pass. And if there's any positive to doing this every year, it's that the next administration can get its footprint onto it pretty quickly. In the past, DoD has been very upset that it only goes year to year to year to year instead of going 3 years, 5 years. It's hard to plan when you only get a budget for a year. But nonetheless, that's the hammer that the Congress has to tell the DOD, hey, you've got to do things. And they've done this during the last couple of years. I mean, one of the NDAAs told them to list the top 10 bases and stations that are most impacted by climate change. When they responded and didn't list, and they wanted them all from each service, each service had to list them. They didn't even list Marine Corps bases when it first came back. They sent it back and said, how about Camp Lejeune, that of course just had a major hurricane, and they redid it. But a lot of these issues that have been pushed onto the DOD during the last 4 years have been ignored. Under the Obama administration, they started the net zero program, meaning that all bases and stations should aim to produce more energy than they consume. And there are many bases that are doing that. And the Air Force has Nellis Air Force Base, for instance. Army's got several, Fort Bliss, that are all using solar energy in a great way, and they're approaching net zero. I think that can be reinforced very quickly in the incumbent administration. And frankly, it's a winner as far as the base commanders are concerned. When I was at Parris Island, we relied almost entirely on the local grid for energy. It was all coal-fired, by the way. And then when that went down, we had our own oil-fired power plant. It was disgusting. Parris Island in the last couple of years now has built a solar array, getting on board with that, going to renewables. So they need to go to renewables all over. You mentioned the Great Green Fleet. My only hang-up with that was calling it the Great Green Fleet. I wish they'd use the Great Expeditionary Fleet, the Great Independent Fleet, Great Renewable Fleet. Secretary Mavis had a good idea, and he did run all ships that are non-nuclear ran on biofuels. And all the aircraft, by the way, in the inventory have been running on biofuels at some point or another, much like Fred Smith has done at FedEx, which, by the way, he's a big proponent of running on biofuels. So the number one consumer of fossil fuels in this country is the Department of Defense. I mean, it's staggering. I mean, it's just staggering. So that's kind of the tactical side of the house. Now let's broaden this again to the strategic side. Here, President Trump badmouths NATO and all our allies. We need more allies. We want them on board. We want them involved in it. We need to support NATO. This troop realignment thing occurring in the last 60 days is very problematic. Needs to be delayed. Let the new administration take a look at it. There's some positives. There's more negatives, in my opinion, depending on how you look at that. I laid out some of the hot spots in the world. We're yanked people out of Africa. When I just detailed some of the stuff in the Sahel, it's just not that easy. You can't just snap your fingers and think, I'm going to do that. Much like pulling the troops out of Germany because you're upset because Angela Merkel didn't come to the conference. I mean, come on. There's a much broader perspective to this. And I'll close on this one. It was General Mattis that said in Iraq that get me off this tether of fossil fuels. When I was an artillery battalion executive officer up in the desert, I was more concerned with where the next gas station was than where the enemy was or where I was going to get ammunition, because once we ran out of fuel, we were dead. And once you stop an artillery battalion, you're targeted, your day is over. And he was right. So there are many cases where you can use renewables or alternative energies all over the world. And we at ASP are in favor of all of them. We're an all above organization. I say that we don't like coal, dead set against coal. And burning of coal, but if there are ways to get off of fossil fuels, whether we look at fusion or other new science and technologies, there are ways to do that, and the DoD can take great advantage of it and can lead the way, by the way, in a lot of these things. You know, a lot of people are fond of saying we got the internet, we got nuclear energy from the Department of Defense. So if that can be done, we can certainly make breakthroughs on the energy side. So just a small part of it. There's a lot of work to be done here. I don't know how the next Secretary of Defense feels about it. I have not read anything specific that he said about climate change, and I've been looking. My guess is he's going to be about like General Mattis, that he'll say, Mattis believed in it, mouthed those words, although when they produced the national defense strategy, which you probably saw, the words climate change weren't in there. You will see those come back. Over to Senator Shaheen.
Well, as you point out, the biggest user of energy in America is the federal government, and DOD is the biggest user within the federal government. One of the things that my energy efficiency bill with Rob Portman addresses is energy use within the federal government. But as you point out, DOD actually has been a leader in the federal government in addressing energy use. And one of the things that drove that was what was our conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, where it was trying to get the fuel into Afghanistan that created a huge challenge for our military. And we were, as you point out, sitting ducks as we were trying to get that fuel into the country. And that resulted in a lot of battles and conflict. And when the military figured out they could use batteries, they could use solar blankets, they could use solar panels for energy, that saved a lot of energy and equipment for our soldiers. So that's, I think, been a very positive step. When I first got on the Armed Services Committee, we battled every time we did a markup of the Defense Authorization Bill over whether we were going to continue to support the development of biofuels within our military. We don't argue about that anymore. That's a given. It's in the budget now. So I think there has been a lot of progress. As you point out, General Cheney, we didn't talk about climate change in terms of our national defense and our national defense strategy, and that is going to change, and that's very positive. But there is certainly a recognition on the part of our military that we've got to address this issue. I want to go back to something that Todd talked about, because we were talking about the importance of investing in, when we make investments, in doing them in a way that addresses our energy use and our carbon emissions. But investments and the financial industry is also going to be very important in helping drive solutions to address climate change. Because one of the things that insurance companies, that Wall Street is finally figuring out, is that there's a huge cost to climate change. And, you know, here in New Hampshire are those people who are in Hampton, at Hampton Beach, for example. The cost of flood insurance has gone up dramatically. It affects home values. That's going to help to drive a response to address climate change. And I think we've got to encourage people to think about that as they're thinking about the costs, the hidden costs that people don't think about when they're looking at climate change.
Well, thank you to you both. It's certainly encouraging to hear that biofuels are not being debated anymore. And General Cheney, I very much appreciate, as a veteran of the Iraq War, you bringing up the issue of fuel convoys, which were, obviously a frequent target for Marines that I served with, as well as those that served in Afghanistan as well over the last 20 years. Last question before we open it up. Todd had mentioned China in his remarks, and General Cheney, you touched on it as well. Obviously a very complex relationship that we have with China. I think if you look at, you mentioned the NDS, if you look at our national defense strategy from both 2018 and 2019, you see the prominence of an emerging China, in the NDS. Recently, there were plans put forth to reconstitute the First Fleet to be ready to, combat the PLA Navy. That said, we have a complex economic relationship with China, and we now have, this, in some ways, needing to be to partner on some efforts regarding climate change. So just wondering, and we'll open it up to any one of our three distinguished panelists, if any of you could sort of comment on, how leaders, both military and diplomatic leaders in our new administration and in Congress, should think about some of these challenges that we face.
Well, maybe I can start us off just briefly. I think that the challenges that China poses are very real, and they're across a broad range of issues. And again, it's one of the few things that is uniting our political spectrum at this point, from Democrats to Republicans. What I think is important, I think that the Biden administration will go in with no illusions and quite prepared to be tough. At the same time, I do not think that they will go in with the kind of existential rhetoric that you saw from Pompeo and Pence and the guy whose name also starts with a P, who's their lead guy at the National Security Council, on China, which is basically, if you have the Chinese Communist Party, you can't deal with China. There's nothing that can be done. We're in a Cold War, in essence. And that's also not the right way to go. And I don't think it's the way that the Biden administration will go. I think that they will understand that this is a relationship where we are going to have to manage competition and sometimes quite intensive competition with places where we need to cooperate. And those will include issues of global concern. By the way, like stopping the next pandemic or dealing with the next pandemic, but also very distinctly and importantly, climate change. There's a reason why I've probably done 10 track 2 meetings with the Chinese over the last 12 months. It's because, and often with my counterpart from when I was at State, that's because they see this as an area that both for the sake of the issue, but also for the sake of having something positive to be able to work on with the United States that they want to do. So I do think that we need to do it. I don't think we should be racing back, falling all over ourselves to try to please the Chinese or anything like that. We need to be tough, but we need to balance. We need to manage the relationship with a balance of competition and where it's possible cooperation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I'll just add, we had the hammer in our hand when this incumbent administration came in here with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we want to step in and use the economy as the hammer to counter Chinese aggression. The military is not the solution here. I mean, I understand where the Indo-Pac commander is coming from, and we know the threat, and we have to be very wary of that, and we have to certainly finance that and keep our forces very, very vigilant and ready. But that's not the answer. The answer, and that's what part of why ASP was founded, that we would far prefer to use diplomacy, use the economy, use other factors before you get on the military side. We're going to continue with the freedom of navigation exercises. We'll continue with deployment of forces over there. I don't see us taking divisions, or in the Marine Corps parlance, expeditionary forces and going to war against China. I just don't see that happening. But we cannot be lax about it, because they are going everywhere in the South China Sea. And I didn't even touch on the Arctic before. The Chinese are building icebreakers. They're building more icebreakers than we are, which is just, it's almost incomprehensible. We're starting to get a little bit of, I think the Biden administration will fix some of that. And the Trump administration is funding for 2 more. But we got a long ways to go in the Arctic. But again, China is putting their fingers into everything. And I think it's more economic and diplomatic, although retain our vigilance on the military side. Over to you, Senator Shaheen.
Well, the only thing that I would add, as Todd alluded to, is that climate change is one place where we ought to be able to cooperate with the Chinese. They are taking really very important steps in China to address their air emissions. I mean, all you needed to do, one of the things that I thought was most interesting at the start of the pandemic, when we saw a lot of the maps of the world and what was happening with pollution, and look what happened when they shut down the Chinese economy in terms of the pollution over China. They understand they've got a problem, excuse me, and we ought to be working together on that issue.
Well, we'll look forward to hopefully some cooperation on this critical issue and leveraging some of our economic tools and certainly strategic deterrence. Thank you to all 3 of you for your insights on this critical topic. Rob, if you want to come back and join us, I think we've got a number of folks from all around New Hampshire that I can see here that have not only joined, but have sent in questions. So that's really exciting, and I want to turn it over to you to hear some of our audience questions for our distinguished panelists.
Thanks, Maura. That was a great discussion with everyone. I think one of the questions that folks are really wondering about is, so where are we 5 years on with Paris in terms of what's been done globally? Where are we with global ambition? And what are the opportunities? What are the things that need to happen at this conference about a year from now in Glasgow, Scotland? And how can we be constructive in building political consensus around what needs to be done globally? I'll start with Todd on that one.
Sure. So where we are 5 years on is in a worse place for two big reasons. One is that this is the Trump administration, right? So the U.S. showed impressive resilience in having states and cities and companies and the civil society doing their best to keep action alive, but at the national level, we just went AWOL. So that hurt, not just with respect to our own emissions, but hurt with respect to the absence of leadership and the absence of somebody who the Chinese or the Indians or the Brazilians or whomever knew was going to be raising this issue and pushing this issue every time they met, which is what you had with Obama and what you obviously would have had if the Democrats had won in 2016. So the absence of the U.S. has hurt. As I said before, at some level you go backwards even if you haven't gone backwards because the understanding of what the goal is has shifted right from below 2 degrees now to as close as we can possibly get to 1.5, with 1.5 really being the objective, 1.5 degrees centigrade as the temperature limit. So and then, beyond that, I think that what you see in some ways, it's not that different from what you would have expected. Countries put in their targets in 2015. There was an understanding that they would be reviewed in 2020, and now it's 21 because of COVID. So it wasn't surprising that countries didn't increase their targets in Paris. And by the way, it wasn't surprising that the targets in Paris were about where they were. The projection for global temperature increase a year before Paris was 3.6 degrees centigrade. Because of the Paris targets, that went down to 2.7. That's a really good move. It's really not enough. But again, we understood that, and built into Paris was this cycle. There's actually two cycles. There's a cycle every 5 years for individual countries to basically ratchet up their targets, and there's a cycle every 5 years to look at the aggregate of countries and what's called a global stock take. The first one of those will be in 2023. So, what has to happen it's not so much exactly what's going to happen there. It's on the way to get there. We need countries, starting with the United States and China, to put on the table strong, realistic commitments for what they're going to do in this short-term period, meaning to 2030, while also being committed to a net zero world in 2050, and to expand that to as many countries as possible through diplomacy and through the kinds of diplomatic pressure that I was talking about before, whether it's coming from us or the EU or the panoply of smaller progressive countries who know they need this or they're not going to survive.
You're on mute, Rob.
I was just asking if other folks wanted to jump in on that question.
Just one little caveat to this. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've always said that, because we have this businessman as president, that he understands the bottom line. And going to renewables is an economic plus. And one of my favorite lines is, President Trump said the war on coal is over. He's right. It's over. Natural gas has eaten its lunch. But natural gas is just a bridge fuel to what's coming next. And you see states going to this all over, and now you're seeing the automobile industry. Look at the number of electric vehicles everybody's introducing now. It's going to be an economic push, and the Biden administration, I know, is going to jump on this issue big time. that we'll go to electric vehicles, will be a nationwide mandate. Of course, when we looked at the fuel standards that the Trump administration threw out, GM's now come back and said they want them brought back. These are all plus signs that I see coming.
Great. Thank you. So there's another question about concerns over the next month or so. What can the current administration do to hamstring the incoming Biden-Harris administration and efforts?
Well, I think he's already done a number of things that are detrimental. Certainly, General Cheney just talked about CAFE standards for emissions in the automobile industry. He's thrown those out. They have rolled back the plans under EPA that would have begun to address climate in America. And they will continue to undermine all of the clean air and clean water regulations, which, again, for air are very important to climate. And he has put political appointees in strategic places where they can do particular damage. Now, unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of this because they are executive actions that have been taken, and we don't have, unless somebody comes before Congress, unless somebody in the news does a report on what's happening, it's hard to get insight into exactly what's happening within departments. I think the good news is that everyone knows we're going to have a new administration taking over on January 20th, and for many of those dedicated employees who recognize that we need to be driven by science in making determinations, whether it was an EPA or the Department of Energy or any other agency within the federal government, they know that they don't need to leave in order to stay true to their scientific beliefs and the policies that we need to promote in order to address climate change and other pollution issues. So I think that's the good news.
I would just add two quick things. One is I think they're going to try to get as many drilling leases out the door as they possibly can before it's midnight for them. And the other thing that's not climate related per se, but it's related to the operation of the federal government, which is that they're doing everything they can to try to change the basic rules that protects the civil service so that a very large number of career people in the government will be able to be fired because of if they're defined as working on policy. So that's a crazy change. I'm sure that the Biden administration will roll that back if they get that done. But they're trying to scorch the earth.
Rob, if I could just put one caveat to this, Biden's building a cabinet and administration of some very well-educated and savvy and understanding people, particularly in the State Department. We'll look and see what happens to DOD. But my point to this is, I think they're going to figure out where everything's buried. Yeah. And they're going to work very, very quickly to undo those things that Trump is doing in the last 60 days to get his agenda and screw things up. I've never seen anything like it. I was the deputy executive secretary to Dick Cheney, unrelated, when Les Aspin came in. And I'm telling you, I watched that transition go, and it was pretty smooth from the Cheney perspective. The other side was a little bit harder, and I could tell some bad stories about it, but it was nothing like what's going on now. I mean, nothing like what's going on now.
What can we do in terms of like a international framework around transition to renewable energy, working with our other countries in terms of training and providing opportunities? And how do you see that as an opportunity?
Should I take that?
Sure.
Yeah, why don't you start?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that is a transition going on. There's tremendous progress being made here. There are a lot of places in the world now, and I mean places like India and others, where it's cheaper to build new renewable than just to operate existing fossil fuels. So that, I mean, and it's gonna keep moving in that direction. And the movement in cost is going to keep going down. Also, with respect to things like battery technology, which you need both for vehicles, but also to use solar and wind in power plants. So I think that's going to continue. I think that what is also very important is that there are still an untenable number of coal plants getting built around the world, most of it with Chinese financing and support, some with support from Korea and Japan, but it's mostly China. And happening in places like Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, others, where I suspect that part of the problem can just be political economy, where you've got powerful fossil fuel companies who are dictating what happens. But it's also, I think, partly that there is not adequate comfort in some of those countries. They know if they get a coal plant, they can, effectively plug it into the wall and start going, whereas they not necessarily have that same level of comfort with how are we going to balance solar and wind on the grid, and so what in the international sphere sometimes called capacity building, but teaching, making sure that the recipient countries have the expertise that they need so that they will get the wind or solar facility and understand that they can work it, that it can work fine and take care of their needs rather than going to coal. So there's still a lot to be done there, but there's also a good story about the incredible cost reductions that have made renewables really competitive now.
I talked about the Zoom meeting we had with the Vice President for the European Green New Deal of the EU. And one of the things we talked about, they have pledged to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, and they're doing a whole range of things. But one of the things they talked about was the financial support that they're giving to certain industries, to individuals. One of the challenges we've got as we think about how do we encourage more of a transition to non-fossil fuels and to alternative energies is, in many places, there's still an additional cost. Todd, you're right. Those technologies are coming down in cost, but for a lot of people, they're still more expensive. And one of the things we have to think about is how we're going to address that with average Americans who may be looking at a higher bill in a number of cases, and how do we provide some assistance for those folks as we're thinking about transitioning this economy, because that's a very real concern, especially right now as people are suffering because of the economic fallout of COVID. So that has to be factored into our thinking, and it's one of the things that we were asking our EU partners about, to let us know what's working there so we can think about how do we make it work here.
Yeah. There's a lot of interest amongst the audience around carbon pricing and how that fits into our international discussions, negotiations, and how that might help a transition. So folks,
does the senator want to speak to carbon pricing?
Well, that's one of the challenges that's being debated. Our bipartisan climate caucus has met with a number of large companies in America who are promoting a switch to a carbon-free economy and the challenges of trying to do that. And one of those challenges I just talked about, and that is how do we address the cost, not on some of those big companies who have the ability to address the cost, but some of the smaller folks who are going to get affected, and how do we do that in a way that keeps people on board and holds them harmless for any impact that they're having. And that's one of the biggest discussions right now. And how do we address that issue?
Rob, maybe I just add a word. I think that carbon pricing would be great if you could get it politically in the United States, but with a big caveat, which is that that those who think you can do the whole job with carbon pricing, and that's been a kind of a drum that economists have beaten in various ways over the years. People who think that, I think, are really very mistaken, because given the scale and speed of the change that we need, the only way you could do this with relying just on carbon pricing is to have a carbon price that is so astronomical as compared to what could be done politically that it just isn't going to happen. The EU has carbon pricing through essentially their version of a cap and trade program, but that's just one of many different tools they use. They use standards, they use all sorts of things. So if a carbon price could be in our toolkit, could be part of what we do, and you could make it happen politically, which I think you probably can't yet, then fine. But nobody should think that that's going to be the whole answer, because you're still going to need the very strong standards and other measures that we do now use.
Well, and in New Hampshire, we have a version of cap and trade. We have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative.
Yeah, exactly, right.
That has been very important in providing savings. But as you point out, it's only one tool.
Right.
You've all been very adept at avoiding the dirty word tax. And anytime you said that, certainly in the last 4 years, people tore their hair out. And I think it has to be avoided. It's got to be looked at from a different perspective. When you look at all the subsidies that are being provided to the different industries, I think what you will see under the Biden administration is a new reinvestment from universities on research and development and new technologies. You'll see that all come back up instead of being taken away as it has been in the last couple of years. DOE is going to become equally more important in this. We didn't even get to the third rail, which was nuclear energy, which we'd ASP support. And the line I use there is the United States Navy has been running small modular reactors accident-free for 60 or 70 years now. So it can be done, but we just haven't invested in that on a commercial side. The nuclear industry has priced itself right out of the business. And we all know why, and we know the drawbacks. Germany shut theirs down, Japan too. Fukushima, Chernobyl are all the ones that everybody runs away. 3 Mile Island, they go, oh my God, well, 3 accidents in 67 years is not a bad safety record when you compare it to coal. So there's a lot of other things we could do here, Rob.
Good. Well, we're just about out of time. We have a couple of minutes left, so I want to bring Maura back in and for some final thoughts and words. Maura, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Rob. And just thank you to General Cheney and to Todd and to Senator Shaheen for spending so much time with us this evening. This has been a terrific discussion. Rob and I were just saying how many people joined from all around New Hampshire. This is one of our record turnouts, which certainly says a lot about our panelists. Although I'm excited, but I can't say I'm very surprised. Knowing, kind of what our lineup here is, but each of you added just so much to this discussion, and it's been absolutely terrific, and we just very much appreciate it. We hope that next time we will be able, General Cheney and Todd, to bring you here in person. Sure. And join LCV and the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and of course with Senator Shaheen here in New Hampshire on the other end of this pandemic. I want to just briefly mention for those that would like some more information on Senator Shaheen's work advocating for us here in New Hampshire on these issues. Invite you to take a look at her July 16th Boston Globe op-ed, which talks about some of the work she's been doing for us on the International Climate Accountability Act, as well as to the coastal mortgage risk, which she mentioned briefly. Some really good sources of information there. And Senator Shaheen, we want to thank you, I think, on behalf of all of the Granite Staters on this call for just your advocacy on behalf of our state on these critical issues, and the role that you will play alongside the new administration as we address these challenges going forward. Certainly, all that you've done to ensure that our Portsmouth Naval Shipyard has the resources it needs to protect itself from some of these threats. And then finally, you know, I am reminded, I think as we all are, as we're virtual right now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, just a thank you to you for leading some of the national efforts, not only for our country, but here for New Hampshire on bringing additional COVID relief home to us here. So thank you for that. And we're certainly honored you were able to spend so much time with us this evening and very grateful.
It's a real honor to be with all of you and to be with Todd Stern and General Cheney and all the great work that you both have done. Thank you very much.
Thank
Well,
you.
Todd, Senator, thank you.
Yeah, thanks to everybody listening to the program, Maura, Rob, and my co-panelists. Very, very, very rewarding. Thank you.
Yeah.
And stay safe, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you all. Take care.